Alrighty, we are back. We are going to answer like a listener question today. Were they responding to the podcast? Who knows? Anyways, a question that we
YouTube
got
or
asked.
something.
Yeah, I think they
YouTube.
were. Yes. And we did, I think we're answering it also in the comments. But we just thought it was actually a pretty good and interesting conversation to talk about. So the question was pitching specific, but I think we'll kind of spin off a little bit to hitting and things like that. But pitching is, we talk a lot about trying to maximize power in pitching. It's a sort of like you're trying to get as much velo in these like very short spurts of the skill. So it's this power move. And, I think we've talked about why we might not train that by doing like long distance runs or, that type of thing. But especially, I think I guess the way they were asking this was a little more at the high school level with travel ball, but I think there's two ways we could take this. But then there's the game, and you might pitch 120 pitches in that game. So you're trying to repeat that over and over a period of 2 to 3 hours with breaks and things like that. So there's some endurance that's needed in that. And then also in an even more like skewed and more challenging way, when you're in the high school level and you're playing travel ball, you might do that a couple times in a day. You might have to come back and do it on day 2. You might also be in the field. You might also be hitting and base running. And there's a lot of things that go along with that. So kind of this question between how do you train for the endurance required in pitching while also not sacrificing the power required. So maybe Ashley, if you want to start with how you answered the question generally with in sort of text form, and then we can spin off from some of the things that we've seen and conversations we've had about this.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question because it really is the challenge. Like we talk about how the way in which pitching is traditionally trained, which is like these hour lessons, you're just throwing and throwing and throwing, or like more is more culture. The question came off of the podcast I think James and I did together, which was like, it was really a velocity centered topic. And the traditional way of just like overthrowing, overtraining is anti-power, it's anti-velocity. And so the question was like, it makes perfect sense. I listened to this in perfect sense, except there's also an endurance element to pitching, like the workload element. So how do you also train that? And I was like, it's just a really good question because this is really where the element of like people have pitchers like running, steady state jogging. They have them doing like long distance things because they think of it as like endurance. And so the way I answered it was kind of like a periodization concept and how we like build volume throughout the year. Now, asterisk, this requires that there's an off season, a preseason, and a season. And so essentially the way we go about it is we make sure, let's say, I'm going to go high school level. It's cleaner in college because there's legitimately a season for each. But the way you go about at the high school level is, let's say like November starts this like off season. Sometimes there's a camp here and there, but they're not just like getting hammered with games every day in and day out. So what we start to do is we bring volume down, and then we gradually over about an 8-week period, like grow that volume, 8 to 12, honestly, like grow that volume. And the volume grows first at like a moderate intensity. Then it starts growing at high intensity. Then you've kind of got just like this like high volume by the time you're getting into January, where we've built their ability to have high volume, both at moderate and high intensity. Now they hit, let's say they have a normal high school season about March. Now they're like 4 weeks before season. Now we've got February, for example. We cut back a little bit on volume. Now we're just asking them to go super high intensity when they are throwing a little more breaks. We're kind of like mimicking what's going to be asked of them. But basically the pitching side of it is that we've built that over time in this very gradual way. That is different than 12 months of the year. We just throw and throw and throw and throw and throw. It's like calculated. It's leading up to when they're going to be asked to do that. It's something different. And then underneath of that, what's important, which I put in the response, is like being paired with strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning has its own approach to basically building resilience in the body. So it's when the approach of like building workload in training, understanding how it connects to season, changing volume and intensity is paired with similar concepts in strength and conditioning. And that's how we do it. This is something I just feel like we just kind of got right early on. Like, how a lot of times we talk about like, oh man, we went down a bad path for a long time and then that sent us in this path. That's the story of everyone's life essentially. But I just feel like almost like by accident, the way we were thinking about periodization, we started to realize like, man, our pitchers are really not, we were so performance based. So we were really holding back in workload in pitching. And then I was reflecting after the first couple summers, like our athletes are not having issues throwing full games, throwing an entire summer. It wasn't even like a conscious, like, okay, how do we make sure they can be resilient? I think we really started as being like super performance based, and then kind of realized like, this is a good approach essentially.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting. Like, as you're talking, and Laura, I'm curious some of the, like, cause we've obviously had this conversation about like the science behind how you build things like this, but I think like, and obviously this stuff comes from like, it's not like malicious or anything, but it's coaches who who didn't have a background in the sort of like this type of thing came up with this idea. Because as you were talking, Ashley, I'm like, okay, we do build volume, but what we don't do is like build to 120 pitches at full intensity. Right. And I think what is so interesting is like, how long have we known that the way you train for a marathon is not by 4 times a week running a marathon? Like, we've known that forever. Like, that's never, I ran a marathon 10 years ago and I followed a basic program, and I didn't even run the marathon. I never ran a marathon before the marathon. Like, I think like you built up to like 20 miles or something. You ran 6 more miles the day of the marathon, and we did it fine. Like, and most of the time during the week for a marathon training, you're running like 3 miles, like 6 miles, like way under what you're doing. And it's so clearly that you were just building up, this workload to be able to do it. And why we knew that and thought like, okay, that's obviously an endurance sport, right? That's the definition of an endurance. You're trying to, and maybe if you're trained, like I wasn't trying to like race or something, but maybe if you're also trying to do it fast. So I don't know, but it's the ultimate example of endurance. And we knew that. And so even if in our minds, we were like, we have to go for endurance, the idea that the way we accomplish it for so long as a community was like, not only are we going to try to throw 120 to mimic the game, but on most days we're going to throw 300 pitches, because then it's easier in the game. It's just like, again, I don't think it was malicious, but it was just like, that's very clearly not how you do this. That has been proven in actual endurance sports and training. So I think that part is kind of confusing how we got there, and probably why we didn't actually, because Ashley, by the time we were doing a program, you and I did come from more of like a science background. I don't know that we ever thought like, this is how we're going to get endurance. Right. Is like,
I think the lesson learned here is like, what you're saying is like, that's not how endurance is trained anyway. But then what I'm saying is like, it's power over endurance. Well, the endurance will come when you train power appropriately. Like that's what I'm saying. Like we kind of stumbled on, essentially, like we went after the power piece because we're like, okay, I think people will listen to us if all of our pitchers start throwing harder. Like that's kind of like years ago. We're like, if our pitchers, if we can make people throw harder, people will like think we know something. And so it turns out that was true. So good job to us. But that's the approach that we took. And then it was just like, wait, our athletes actually have no problem. It's because they have super solid strength and conditioning behind them. Their movement quality is excellent. Like we actually throw a lot of volume. It's just in order to tap into good trunk arm sequencing and timing, we do it a lot of sort of what I call cycling and changing low to high intensity. So they actually have a lot of volume. It's not crazy for them to throw 100 pitches in a session, but probably like only like 60 at max would be at high intensity, so like they actually don't get a ton of high intensity pitches, but they built this like foundation underneath of them. So that didn't come from building endurance. That's what I think. It's just like that approach is what we took to build power, to build performance, not just power, but performance. We wanted break and velocity. So that's the approach we took for that. So in my mind, I think like train in a way that prioritizes performance. And then what comes along with that is this sort of like endurance. When in reality, when you switch it, when you just think about prioritizing endurance for your pitchers, it's at the cost of usually the art form and the power piece, which is not pitching. It's not pitching.
I think that one of the most key things to remember is that like the fatigue is from the ground up. So any instance where you're talking about training the arm and doing wild volumes of arm circles separate from the trunk, K drills, kneeling to like build your arm endurance is that's actually not what fatigues. I mean, obviously the limbs do fatigue. It comes from the trunk. It comes from either, the trunk itself. It comes from an inability to manage creating a load in a ideal way, in an efficient way. And the limbs become the victim to that. The arm especially becomes the victim to that. So I always say that arm pain is a trunk problem. And when we talk about the fatigue piece, it's not just it isn't just whole body. It is specific to the trunk in pitching because of its requirement to be the base of support for the limbs. And you were going to use the exact same example I was going to talk about, Krista, about literally marathon training. We never run that distance. We have never advocated for that. Well-trained runners know that you never go out and run 26.2 as a training modality. And so, I think, you'd mentioned, Ashley, kind of stumbled upon this, but I give a lot of credit to, Carly's background with strength and conditioning of just thinking what is the work to rest ratio? What is the actual, when we went to our movement assessment, what is the task? And that extends to physiologically, what is the task? Not just what do you need from a movement standpoint. And so I always use the phrase, it's repeatability of power. So that's the endurance piece, is being able to produce that power over and over again. And when we talk about energy systems, sometimes when I use the phrase energy systems, I get this puzzled look from coaches, and it's fair because it's not an easily approachable topic without a background somewhat in exercise science. But our adaptations to training are so specific to the way that we train. And so if we are trying to support a pitcher at this really short duration, high intensity movement, she needs all kinds of stressors underneath of her then to help her be resilient to that. But we have energy systems, 3 primary, that we use without even thinking about it in terms of creating power over and over again, right? And so when we stay out of, I love that you use the word steady state, when we stay out of steady state training, it doesn't mean that it never has a place. It's not that marathon runners never sprint. That's not where they spend their time, right? There can be instances where sprinting in particular legs of a marathon are important, or at the end when you're trying to make a push. There's lots of ways to go about that. But pitchers should not be spending their time long periods of steady state training. It is not a match for what the pitching motion is. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a place, but it cannot be the primary place that they live, and then have this significant gap with what the motion actually is, what the movement actually is. That's such a mismatch. And the other side of that is okay, if we're in the right energy system, how quickly does that recover? And the energy systems we tap into right away, they take a little bit to recover. It's why a change of innings is actually really important. It's why building in, I kind of sometimes when our tech gives the pitcher sort of a built-in break, because they won't take one, right? They'll just keep throwing and throwing and throwing, and they need that recovery. It can be a minute to 2 minutes max. It's just, that's what that particular system needs to just rebuild itself for a second, to let the nervous system kind of recover, and then she can go right back into it. It's that repeatability over and over and over again of power that really is what we're talking about when we're talking about training pitchers for the longevity of a 7-inning game, a solid 4 innings, whatever it is you want to utilize her for.
I definitely think I can appreciate that at least underhand throwing is complicated, because it's the only position in the field where you're trying to go for power with this endurance component. There's no doubt. It's very unique. It's what makes it really complicated to train. So the complexity of it, where I simply just don't, we just totally missed the mark, and I can't, I don't even know why we do this. It's in hitting and overhand throwing, where people throw overhand anywhere from
1
0
million times
to 7 times a game, and you swing 10 to 15 times a game. And then I get it. It's people say muscle memory or something, but I'm thinking of a circumstance we just had with a high school level athlete who has a stress fracture in her forearm, essentially, and in her elbow. And I'm thinking I don't know everything, but there's just based on what you're describing and based on what your patterns, there's no way this is from pitching. She's just a total topspin pitcher. Her arm never gets in that type of slot. She went the whole summer, no issues. And then we got to the root, obviously. Right. And then we got to the, she started high school ball, and they threw overhand for hours and hours and hours. And I'm that one is just that one infuriates me. At least when pitching, people get it wrong in pitching. I'm well, it's really complicated. I give people evidence, it's really complicated. But the hitting and overhand throwing piece, and just especially because we know so much about overhand throwing, we know how tough it is on the, do they overthrow in baseball in overhand, or are they more educated?
I'm sure they do. Yeah, definitely.
That also makes no sense.
The youth level. I think before we move to that, because I have a lot of thoughts on that, because I think hitting is even different than overhand throwing. I think it's like there's the one thing I was going to say to this pitching conversation is there's also a point where you don't train and it's too much. And so I think there's a point in this youth level where, like, if a kid is being asked to throw 3 games over 2 days, that's too much. And the training is not going to do that. So you try to make sure she's resilient as hell, but like her performance is going to be down. Like there's just too much. And it's not the skill, and it's not the preparation for college, because that's not what you're going to be asked to do in college. And you are going to, maybe in order to do that successfully, I guess I would say, is like to not get hurt or something, is more of this like endurance, steady state type training. But that is at the cost of being a good pitcher. And so, like, I think there is just an element, and that's where we get all the way back to this, like, how the youth system
Krista, which is where most people live. That's where most kids live in.
Yeah, mediocre. I'm at 50. I could throw 58, 55 to 58, and I can never go higher than that because I don't have power.
But I pitch
and I can't
500 pitches a week.
Right. And because I can hit my spots, I have success at the youth level. And then I don't understand why I lose that success at the college level when it becomes about my actual performance. So I think that's the only asterisk I would say to this, is that yes, we do not have issues. I was thinking of my own team, and I use that example a lot because just like we are in the field doing these things. And I had a team, and my pitchers, 100% what you said, by the end of the season, they threw, I didn't even monitor it, to be honest. Like by nationals, like I think I had a kid throw 150 pitches one game, and she was fine. She was a little sore the next day, but like, and I wasn't worried about it. They had been built. But what I wouldn't have done and couldn't have done, and they weren't trained to do, was turn around and throw that kid 150 pitches the next day and think like she was going to be fine from that, and then throw her again the next day. So like that, I would say, is the asterisk. Like we don't train our kids for that. And if our kids get put in that environment, that would be the time where it's like,
then we're pissed.
She does have arm pain, and she does, her back hurts, and those types of things. But throwing a complete game, 150 to 200 pitches, even throwing these really long games by the end of the season when you're trying to do that, our kids have no issue with that. They're built for that by the time that they built up to that. But I think there's a limit for that.
Just like,
yeah. All right. Flipping. I think overhand throwing and hitting, I would put in 2 separate categories. Overhand throwing it's a complicated one for me. For what you said, like I just don't get it. There's plenty you can do with not throwing. There's plenty you can do with throwing lower intensity, building up, like thinking about what your practice should look like, that it's not all full, understanding also the other positions that kid does. It's like we have pitchers sometimes who like barely play first base, and then they throw like 4 million overhand throws. It's like, what are we doing? Like have her receive or something, like have her do what she's actually going to be doing. So that I think is, and again, overhand throwing, like there's slot issues with overhand throwing. So you do need reps to like learn how you receive from different angles and things. So that's different than pitching, where you're trying to like, yes, you're trying to manipulate the ball, but you're also kind of doing the same skill over and over. So you do need reps from that standpoint, I think. But overhand throwing is also for power. And so like totally sacrificing that is confusing, because you need these kids to throw hard. That's the goal. So I think there's a balance there. Hitting, I would put in a category that's like not complicated in the way that pitching is complicated, but complicated in how you get better. So I think with hitting, what we have found is like you do need to, like, the training is the feedback, and the training is the way that the kids get better. When they get feedback of like that inside pitch, I got jammed on, this velo, I got jammed on, I struggle on backspin and it goes this direction, and they can see the ball and they can be challenged in that way. That's how we get our hitters better, and obviously we're going after patterns and things like that, but way more on the flip side, the like feedback of the actual session is how they get better, and they learn adjustability, and they learn to make adjustments on based on what the ball is doing and things like that. And so there is kind of like, if you did 3 swings, like, and you got you didn't have enough time or reps. I wouldn't say muscle memory is not probably the word or what we're going for here, but if you didn't have enough reps to see some feedback and make some adjustments, then you probably didn't get that much out of that session. And so there's this like give and take and balance of what that looked like. So I would say our hitters typically are about 40 to 80 swings in a session, depending on time of year. And at least half of those are at front toss would be the, lower intensity because it's front toss. And then they go, depending on time of year and how much high intensity we want them to do, whether that's machine or live, or cutting back some of the lower intensity stuff. And that, like, 80 is probably never a volume that a pitcher is doing. So there's also asterisks to, like, okay, how are we monitoring that? So, but
or a kid that has not a good, like, strength and conditioning background, low movement
correct.
quality.
Or like, there's two patterns, like hyperextension in the back and rotating through knee flexion, that we would cut that down even more, because it's just like something that we know is kind of like red flag for pain type of thing. So I think that doesn't match. 80 swings in a session is not remotely close to what the skill is required. And I think why we still need that volume is for what I said, like the way I believe a hitter gets better. And we've seen that a hitter gets better as you give her enough opportunity to, like, have feedback in that session, to learn, to see good, bad, what's wrong, what's challenged. And so I think you are going, though, for power in the sense you're going for bat speed. And so you got to kind of watch what that looks like. And there are times where even in a session, we're like, nope, cut it off. Like, at this point,
we hit the threshold.
We're just like, you're so tired. And I referenced this before we started recording. I had a conversation with a person from 40 Motion today, and they go and measure at the MLB combine, and they do about 15 swings because their unit can, like, keep gathering swings. So he was saying in the time frame, sometimes hitters can get about 15. And he said even by the end of that, and these are people, in the MLB or trying to be in the MLB, that by the end of that 15 swings, their patterns have started significantly declining, like they've changed. And so I think also thinking about, when I say we do 40 to 80 swings, it's like sets, so it's like, okay, you're going to do this drill 3 with each overload bat. And then they have to switch bats, they have to change things. And so it's also not like, I'm going front toss, I'm tossing rapid fire. Like there's breaks and there's some pace with that too. That's not so intense.
That they have to hit 80. You're like, if they're not feeling well, not, they're just like, the session is just like not going well, or they're crushing it. Like maybe that's all they need, just to feel like they can tap into it. It's not like we're going for a particular volume. That's the range we end up in, but it certainly is not the same volume. I mean, they might take 80 swings in a high school season. I mean, I'm guessing, but in terms of like in a game. So I think, like, it's not a volume component. It's like swing decisions, and making swing decisions not under fatigue when you've swung 800 times in a session, just, freaking, rapid toss.
Right.
So I think it's a same concept of, like, volume. Yes. But, like, intentional volume and volume before things start to break down. And it becomes,
and it progresses. You don't have someone walk in day one. You're like, here's your 80 thing. You build them up to that. It matches what you're saying. It considers their level of efficiency in the movement. It considers their strength and conditioning, their movement quality. Like, there are pieces
other skills they
also
play if they're a pitcher. Like
other sports. Too, that's a whole other podcast. Other sports.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like this time-based approach to lessons and practice. Like, I struggled with this as a team coach, because we'd have a 2-hour practice. I'd write it out and I'd be like, shit, we're gonna be done in an hour and a half. Like, it was the benefit of having 18-year-olds at the end. I was like, we're done. Like, I like, just like make up shit to fill the time is not super helpful, And I think when we feel like, Ashley, you and I reference this a lot, when we were in the lesson model, there's all this pressure of like, okay, I got to get in, I got to really get their bang for their buck in 30 minutes. And then if the kid was struggling, I was like trying to like literally throw it to their bat. So the parents were like, oh, you're amazing. Like, it's just like, there's so many things. And like, our kids are following a program now. So when I say 40 to 80 swings, the most we would do is cut back from that. We're not filling time. So they're not going to like, oh, I finished in 20 minutes. I have 10 more minutes. Can I get some more reps? No, you're done with your program. Like, and so we also, that allows us to really, with some, there's the, can I have one more happen and things like that. So it's not like exactly the number, but we have a very good idea, because we do it like that, of if they do have soreness or something, and it is coming from our program, of like where to try to cut back on that. Like, I just saw a message internally from our hitting coach to like the pitching group of like, there's a kid that does both, and she takes a long time with pitching, and by the time she comes to hitting, it's kind of a waste. And so asking like, hey, on this day, can we cut volume, whatever, it's not like we're like, no, do your full hitting program, even though you look crappy and you're exhausted. Like we have this give and take that we can measure. And so I think that's where we got into trouble, I think, a little bit. And maybe where we started thinking like, let's throw as many pitches as possible. Is like, I think the time-based structure is tricky. And I know there are some things that we have to do in college, and obviously you're fitting in windows and whatever that looks like. But I think just thinking more of like, the reason the overhand throwing gets out of control is because you have a 2-hour practice and you pay no attention to what's happening. And in that, if you're just trying to cram reps into that 2 hours and you haven't paid attention, for myself, when I had to do defensive practices, like I had to lay that out because I can see where you would get into that. So we would build like, okay, for the first round of defense, there's 0 throws. You're putting it into a bucket behind you. For the second round of defense, it's a light throw to, the base next to you and you're putting it in. Like we would have to really intentionally build in what it looked like. And then I would even write in, like, if my pitcher played another position, like, Sally is only going to throw every third. Like we would even write that into the practice plan. So I think that's where you get into trouble with overhand, is you feel like I have a 2-hour practice. I got to fill it. We're going to do defense today. And so we're going to just throw the whole time. And I think you have to kind of consider, like, at least somewhat, are you paying attention to what volume that looks like? Even, maybe you're not counting every throw because that's not realistic, but is there some way that you can monitor what volume that is? But I think that gets tricky, is like, if you are trying to just fill some gap of time, then you just start doing more and more reps.
Well, and on top of that, in addition to the time, no one wants to have a lesson where it looks like people are going at moderate intensity. People hate that.
Right.
Moderate intensity.
Why is she sitting there? What's she doing? Why is she taking a
break?
break?
Like sitting. And we're like, we used to feel that too, but now we're like, no, we'll just pop up our trend lines. And then people are like, sounds good. It's just like, basically at the end of the day, people, when you can show them that their trends are on the way up, they're getting better, break is better, velo is better, they're not like, why is she sitting? I'm like, she's resting. We're trying to maximize.
Less.
Yeah. Right.
And
they're like, cool. So that's why we were like, the fact that we can show progress. It's not just like, it's not like subjective. We started to just rely on that and be like, no, so we never have we don't want the parent to see her sitting down, taking rest, things like, we don't have anything like that anymore. But we used to, before we felt like confident in being able to show the results. So I was thinking, if this podcast needs a name, it could be like reason 3048 why the lesson model ain't it. Like all the things about a lesson that are like, it's not it for when it comes to like growth. It's not periodization. It's not performance based. It's like this is nice, but it's like sales pitch,
Well, and the idea that you're gonna like get as many swings or as many pitches as possible one time a week in that session, like this concept of building over time, of being able to fluctuate volume based on time of year. Like I've a lot of times when people are talking about our training, they'll be like, how long does it typically take when they're doing it, whether it's a remote athlete or in person? And I say, like, it fluctuates. And also what you start to realize, like, we'll have someone come in-house to train and they're like, hey, I got to leave. I only have 40 minutes today. And because they see it as it's just a piece of their program that they're doing. Like we'll modify that day. They'll just do one thing. They'll do a little less volume. We'll tell them how to then change the rest of the week or whatever based on that. And everyone's not like freaking out about that. I think it's just like the fact that in a lesson once a week that we ever thought that's how we were going to build endurance, also for a variety of reasons, for like definitely throwing 300 pitches is not building endurance, but also doing 300 pitches one day a week.
There's no
definitely
adaptation
not
there.
like,
no adaptation.
That's not the game plan. We had an athlete, this is hitting. And so I think, and she's a catcher. I was actually going to say to you, I think probably, and this might be a Kaylia conversation, I think it's something Kaylia has been like exploring a little bit with catching. Because I would say probably the one, it's not the same. You're not trying to throw like the ball as hard as you can, but catching is an example. Like you have to be able to block, and that's a power move, and you have to keep that. And catchers do catch 3 games in a day, like whether that's good or not, I don't know. But like I would say catching is arguably one that I would put in this category of like very complicated. And I'm not sure we really are the people to answer that yet, but something to look at. But we had a catcher, she hits with us mostly, but also catch, who was prepping for her college fitness test, which was to run a mile under 8 minutes, which, okay, we'll just leave that there. It is what it is, whether it's just, okay. And but was given really like no guidance on how to train for that. Was incoming freshman, so had a lot of anxiety about like doing it or whatever. And so we didn't know, but she ran the mile almost every day in preparation for this. And what we saw during that time period, and her volume wasn't crazy with us, she's just a hitter or whatever. And, but was that her stability like very quickly trended on a downward, and her exit velo went down. Like, you know, we saw these, and that's how we ultimately figured out what was happening, because I was like, what the hell is happening here? You know, like, and so we were asking
endurance
questions,
at the cost of performance.
Right. Well, and what's crazy is, and it, you know, this is no fault to her, that's just like the athletes don't know, is I said, when you were training for it, was there ever a time you didn't hit the 8-minute mark? And she's like, no. And I was like, you don't have to do it every day then. Like, that's not how you keep it. But she didn't know, and no one guided her. So it's like, literally, whether we agree or not with that fitness test, most of our kids could probably run that fitness test just fine. And they need to do it maybe once a week to be able to like do it. But they don't know that. So I also think like that comes a lot of times from the guidance, is that we think we have these fitness tests that we might even probably would argue are not even great fitness tests for the skill. But even if they were, then we think the way we train for that is to have these kids do it over and over and over and over. And then that, now it's like, wait, what are we accomplishing here? This kid is going to pass this fitness test. That fitness test doesn't even measure whether she's good at her sport or not, but that's whatever. And then now during that time period of training for that thing, she has significantly regressed and gone down in the actual thing that you care about. So I think it's just monitoring that setup, and kind of what that looks like, and really understanding it. So it's like, even if, and maybe come to us and we'll talk to you, because we will probably disagree with you, but even if you're like, the way I'm going to know if my pitchers are ready is if they can run a under 8-minute mile, the most they need to do that is like once a week. Like, you don't need them to do that every day after their session or whatever. So I think that there's lots of just like continuing to talk about this concept and what it looks like. And at the end of the day, this is why it's so important to be measuring performance, because at the end of the day, what we all should care about, and what you're talking about with your strength coach, is performance. And so maybe that conversation is, her performance is excellent right now, but when she gets to the 50 pitch mark, it's a big drop off. And maybe that's really what you're talking about. And then we should talk about volume and things. But if it's like an arbitrary thing in your head, and then you're like arbitrarily going after endurance, but you're watching everything tank from a performance standpoint, it's like, what are we doing here? So I think just like, that's why you need to measure everything. At a minimum, measure velo over the course of a thing, or, you know, location might be the first thing to go or whatever. And then I think there's two questions you're asking yourself, is like, is that, you know, this is again from pitching a little bit, but is that a volume that we realistically need her to do? So like, if she started going on pitch 150, is that real, that you're like, she doesn't have the endurance? Or is that just like, that was too much, like we can't prep her for that? Or is it pitch 50, you know, and this is what we saw, she stopped hitting locations. And so, right, how are we going to build workload up for that? Or her velo started going down, how are we going to build workload up for that? Maybe some of it's efficiency, and you can't, and workload's not going to do it. And that's just the role of that kid. There's a lot that goes into it. So the only way you're going to be able to have an educated conversation about that is if you measure something, and not just like, from my eye, she looked tired, which is also not great.
The other consequence of that long distance running, I think that we don't, I see it in movement quality, is like, they're not runners. They're not trained to run. And so they end up in postures that are just, their lats start to anterior.
The lat, but double lat always. It's like, as soon as we see double lat on a non-pitcher, even on a pitcher, if they always had just their throwing side and the other one red light, as soon as we see that, the first question we ask is, did you start running more?
I mean, there are running mechanics that are highly inefficient, that are dangerous because of the position. And a lot of it has to do with, you know, basically where your balance is and your stride. There's a lot of thought that goes into the stride length and cadence of a long distance runner. It's not just go out and run, right? And it's not like they don't lift and they don't sprint. We talked about that, but like the consequence to this long distance running, especially when those athletes are not runners themselves and no one's coaching them on the running form. You know, in our facility, you know, James will say often, like, we will sprint, but we will not sprint under fatigue, because you're your sprint form goes down, just like the swing. After 15 swings, your swing changes. And so if you're running and trying to do that step by step by step over and over and over again, your body's just going to adapt. And so then you end up stuck in anterior tilt. You've lost your rotation, and it becomes this double whammy of like, you've cut your power out from underneath of you, literally, because you're in the wrong physiological system. And your movement quality now is all forward, right? Which does not help your posterior chain, whether you're a pitcher, hitter, or a fielder. It doesn't matter, right? You need both sides. And I think like there's always a double whammy to that when they're unmonitored, just going out and running.
Right. Well, it's the same thing we also see catchers fail double lat sit in that because of the position they're in. Like there are consequences of being in a certain position over time. So I think this is probably, we said maybe next week we'll have James on. I think this would be a good conversation to ask him, which is like, you know, there's probably some like bike work and things. There's things that we would, when strength and conditioning is going after this, which they might or do, there's certain ways for softball players that we would go after it that probably isn't just go out and run 2 miles, you know, like that is a way that makes sure, again, because what we don't want to see as the skilled people, where I'm going to get fired up if I'm the freaking coach, is when my kids, I'm like, that's great that they're in shape, but now they can't stand on one leg and they are in anterior tilt and their performance is going down. It's like strength and conditioning is supposed to be supporting. It's supposed to be supporting. So you need them, yes, to help build this underlying thing, but not at the cost of performance. And so there have to be considerations for like, how are we going to go after that thing, knowing what is required in the skill and making sure that we're not sacrificing that with the way we're going after it, which we, you know, Laura, I agree with you almost always. If running is the way you're going, long distance running is the way you're going after it, in addition to like the variety of things that doesn't promote 100%. Like we see so many like posture things and stuff that comes as a result of that are very detrimental to our sport.
And we compromise all the time. You know, if we have athletes, I do this a lot. You know, I'll see their movement quality decline. Usually my spidey sensors are tingling. I'm like, what you got going on? And they're like, oh, you know, I go out and I run for, 2 miles every other day. I'm like, can we compromise? If you got to get outside and move and, that's good for your brain and good for you to be connected like that, let's just compromise. Let's bring the intensity way down, still spend that time, but like there's education that goes along with that. And oftentimes they're willing to meet you in the middle. They just for them, sometimes that connection to that sort of steady state exercise response is mental. And I appreciate that, fully. Let's just meet in the middle. Let's have a compromise that does not take away.
Yeah. It's complicated. This is definitely a different podcast, but for women,
James,
totally,
I know, like James, we're coming for you. The guy that asked this question was like, this is not where my brain is going, basically. He was just like, I just want to know what you do in pitching. We're like, but let us tell you about steady state.
Why do women go out and do long distance running is also like this. There's a lot of layers here that we're
I think we just created like 4 more podcast topics off of this conversation.
But part 2, bringing James.
Why women think that they should be training endurance sometimes. Like there's a lot of,
and we should talk about multiple sports at one point because we need to talk about the fatigue piece of that at some point. So we'll toss that in.
All right.
So we're set with our podcast topics for the next 3 years. We're good.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, we will be probably next week back with James. We're going to, I would say,
let's bring in James
for this conversation, and then maybe all 3 of us with James, we can like really nail it.
Will we all be together next week?
Oh yes, we could be in person.
Yeah, we will.
Podcast.
Right on. Fancy.
All right. Well, until next week when we talk about the same topic. See you then.